Heartless senator turns in his illegal immigrant housekeeper. What follows deeply moves him. That was the exact headline a local political gossip site used when rumors began swirling about the sudden crisis that erupted in the household of Senator Gregory Blake Farnsworth, a man whose icy demeanor and unyielding ambition had catapulted him to national prominence in the United States. The phrase sounded almost ludicrously sensational, but as it turned out, the events behind it were indeed extraordinary. People whispered that the senator had discovered that his own housekeeper was undocumented and had, in a moment of cold calculation, decided to turn her in. They also whispered that whatever followed that decision shook Farnsworth in a way no one could have anticipated. Senator Farnsworth was, by most accounts, a man shaped by power and politics rather than by warmth or compassion. He was in his late 40s and had served 2 terms in the United States Senate, representing a moderately sized but influential state on the East Coast. His public persona was that of a no-nonsense legislator who believed in the rule of law above all else. His speeches, televised often on C-SPAN and quoted in major newspapers, emphasized a strict stance on immigration enforcement, strong national security, and financial austerity in government spending. Despite his tough rhetoric, Farnsworth had never lacked for allies. He was adept at forging alliances with powerful lobbyists, party insiders, and wealthy donors. He also had a particular gift for reading polls, anticipating shifting voter sentiments, and molding his platform accordingly. Even though he often came across as unemotional, aloof, or even harsh, those who worked closest with him recognized an undeniable brilliance beneath the stony exterior. He was known to bury himself in policy briefs late into the night, meticulously preparing for interviews or congressional hearings. Critics and supporters alike viewed him as a machine who never missed a beat. He lived outside Washington, D.C. in a grand residence not far from the Beltway. Though not quite the stately mansion of an oil baron, it had enough square footage and land to rival any private estate. A tall, wrought-iron gate, flanked by sentinel-like security cameras, protected the property from prying eyes. Behind the gate, a manicured driveway curved toward the main house, a gracious 3-story structure with imposing columns and a wraparound porch. In that house, quietly tending to domestic tasks, was Elena Perez. She had arrived over a year ago, recommended by one of Farnsworth's aides, whose cousin knew a reliable housekeeper looking for work. Eleanor was unassuming in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a calm manner. She was the first to awaken every morning, ironing the senator's shirts, dusting off the study where he pored over policy memos, wiping down the granite countertops in the sprawling kitchen so that breakfast preparations could begin smoothly. Farnsworth rarely acknowledged her with more than a curt "thank you" if she handed him something, or a nod if she happened to cross his path in one of the long corridors. He believed in strict boundaries. Household staff were employees, not friends or confidants. Elena accepted this arrangement. She performed her duties efficiently, quietly, and without complaint. Nonetheless, she had her own hopes and fears that existed far beyond the walls of the senator's house. Hopes for a better future, and fears about her immigration status, which she tried not to dwell on. While Elena went about her daily chores, Senator Farnsworth navigated a different world. Long days at the Capitol involved subcommittee hearings on issues like defense spending and immigration legislation, private lunches with influential donors, and high-stakes negotiations with party leaders. He was also engaged to Veronica Russell, a rising star in political strategy circles. Veronica came from a well-known family in New England, with deep ties to philanthropic organizations and historical connections to politics. She had worked on several prominent campaigns in the past, sharpening her ability to network and to orchestrate large fundraising events. From the outside, their engagement seemed like an ideal match. Farnsworth provided the established political clout, and Veronica brought style, strategic savvy, and a sense of glamour that could play well with upper echelon donors. The press enjoyed speculating that once they married, Farnsworth might set his sights on even higher office, a governorship, maybe even a presidential run if the stars aligned. Closer observers, however, whispered that their relationship seemed more like a partnership of ambition than a love story. Farnsworth appeared distant even with Veronica, but she didn't seem to mind, as long as the arrangement served both their interests. If Farnsworth was controlling at work, he was equally so in his personal life. The staff, including Eleanor, had been subjected to his rigid expectations. Everything in the house was to function on an exact schedule. No personal items visible in the common areas. No conversation with guests unless spoken to first. While many in Farnsworth's position would at least try to project kindness for optics, Farnsworth was known for his cool efficiency. That no-nonsense posture had served him well, or so he believed, enabling him to avoid the sorts of scandals that plagued many high-profile politicians. His political platform, particularly on immigration, had earned him a reputation for uncompromising firmness. He supported increased border security, stricter visa requirements, and robust enforcement. For Farnsworth, these positions were simply practical. Rule of law was paramount. Emotional pleas about family separation or dire economic circumstances were secondary to the necessity of fixing a broken system. Though it garnered him some harsh labels from opponents, it also energized a considerable segment of his voter base that favored tighter control. Into this context fell a peculiar rumor, one that reached a local political blog known for scandal-driven headlines. An anonymous tip suggested that Farnsworth's own housekeeper might not have proper documentation. At first, Farnsworth brushed aside the rumor. It was hardly the first time political gossip had tried to smear him. However, the story took on a life of its own, especially when someone in the staff overheard the speculation and passed it along to Farnsworth's communications director. Then a low-level staffer covertly tried to confirm Elena's status, rummaging through old forms in the records Farnsworth's household kept. Before long, Farnsworth found himself in possession of enough evidence to suspect that Elena Perez was indeed undocumented. Some registration details for her background, given when she was hired, appeared sketchy upon closer inspection. Her social security number was invalid, her references impossible to verify. Farnsworth felt a rising sense of alarm. If a journalist confirmed this, the optics would be disastrous. A senator who based part of his career on strict immigration enforcement was harboring an undocumented immigrant under his own roof. It would be political dynamite for his rivals, especially with an upcoming election cycle not far off. One evening, he confronted Elena in the corridor, leading from the kitchen to a side entrance. He did it abruptly, choosing a moment when Veronica was away at a fundraiser. Eleanor, caught by surprise, looked up from a basket of freshly folded towels. Farnsworth's expression was as cold as the polished marble under their feet. "I need to ask you something," he began, his voice clipped. "Where exactly are you from, and how did you enter this country?" Elena's eyes widened with confusion, then apprehension. "I'm originally from Mexico, sir," she replied softly, lowering her gaze. Farnsworth's lip curled with faint distaste at the word sir, though he didn't correct her. "And your papers, your documentation, I've been told there's a problem with them," she stammered, hugging the towels closer. I thought everything was in process. He raised a hand to cut her off. "Listen carefully. If you're not here legally, I can't keep you employed in this house, and given my position, I can't ignore this. I hope you understand how serious this is." Her cheeks blanched. She swallowed hard and mumbled something about having tried to fix her status, about not wanting to cause trouble. Farnsworth nodded tersely, feeling a flicker of discomfort at her obvious terror. But in his mind, the political stakes overshadowed any pangs of conscience. He ended the conversation with a terse statement, "I'll have to report this." She started to plead, but he brushed past her, heading to his study. As he closed the door behind him, he took a moment to gather himself. His heart was pounding more than he cared to admit, not from compassion, but from tension. He detested vulnerabilities. He quickly logged the relevant information and made a phone call to a contact in the Department of Homeland Security, emphasizing the need for discretion. In that moment, he felt a grim satisfaction that he had taken decisive action. He always believed in swift resolutions to problems, whether in legislative negotiations or in private dilemmas. Undocumented staff under his roof? That was a liability. Better to eliminate the risk promptly, even if it felt harsh. The following morning, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrived at the property. They were dressed in plain clothes to avoid tipping off the press. The head of Farnsworth's private security met them at the gate, showed them inside. Elena was found packing her few belongings in a small suitcase, tears streaking her face. They escorted her out to an unmarked sedan as Farnsworth watched from an upstairs window, standing half-hidden behind a curtain. Snow had begun to fall, lightly dusting the lawn. The grey sky matched his mood, or perhaps underscored the absence of feeling he believed he ought to have. Downstairs, the staff whispered among themselves, cautious not to let Farnsworth hear. They wondered if Elena had received any warning, if she had a chance to say goodbye to friends or family. They wondered if the senator even cared. When Veronica returned that evening, she heard the news from Farnsworth himself. She paused momentarily, setting down her coat. An undocumented worker. That's so unfortunate, she said in a tone mixing relief and faint dismay. At least you dealt with it before it got out. Farnsworth gave a curt nod. That was precisely his line of thinking. The conversation ended quickly, replaced by talk of an upcoming fundraiser. Veronica was in the midst of planning an elaborate event for big donors at a 5-star hotel in Washington, D.C., and she wanted Farnsworth's input on the seating arrangement. Yet, in the quiet moments of that evening, Farnsworth found himself recalling the way Elena's face had crumpled as she realized he was about to destroy her livelihood and possibly her chance to stay in the United States. He shook off the memory, convincing himself that mercy was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. He had a political career to protect, and politics thrived on image, consistency, and unwavering stances. Nonetheless, a faint unease grew in him as days passed. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in senatorial duties. He chaired a hearing on a proposed immigration bill, ironically emphasizing the importance of border enforcement. That night, he dined with key donors who supported his re-election campaign. He returned home late, bypassing the now empty area where Eleanor used to keep supplies. At times, he believed the emptiness was in his mind, but he dismissed it with a firm set of his jaw. Meanwhile, outside Farnsworth's carefully curated bubble, murmurs about Elena's removal began to spread. A small local blog, known for sensational pieces, ran a headline that blared: "Milionário sem coração descobre que sua empregada é uma imigrante ilegal", e a denuncia. O que acontece depois deixou ele emocionado. The story alleged that Farnsworth, a multi-millionaire politician, the blog used millionaire in a loose sense, referencing his considerable net worth and property holdings, had coldly turned over his undocumented housekeeper to ICE. The piece was more rumor than fact, but it quickly gained traction on social media. While some commented that Farnsworth was consistent with his tough stance, others decried him as hypocritical and heartless. The senator's communications team tried to quash the speculation. Farnsworth's press secretary issued a bland statement, neither confirming nor denying the rumor. But in an age of viral sharing, the story was picked up by a handful of mainstream reporters who started asking questions around the edges of Farnsworth's staff, trying to verify the details. An uneasy hush fell over Farnsworth's household. 1 week after Elena's abrupt removal, Farnsworth arrived at his office on Capitol Hill to find a note on his desk. It was from his chief of staff, mentioning that a lawyer named Grace Randall had called repeatedly, claiming to represent someone formerly employed at the Farnsworth residence. The lawyer wanted to speak about potential violations of labor law, as well as intimidation. Farnsworth frowned deeply. Labor law? Intimidation? This was the last thing he needed in a re-election year. He tried ignoring the calls, but Randall persisted. Eventually, Farnsworth's communications director pulled him aside and said that if they brushed the lawyer off, she might escalate the story to bigger outlets. "We should at least hear what she has to say," the director advised. Farnsworth reluctantly agreed to a private meeting with Grace Randall. Late one afternoon, once the day's legislative sessions had ended, he sat in his spacious Senate office, the tall windows overlooking the historic buildings of Capitol Hill. The door opened and Grace walked in, a composed, resolute figure in a tailored suit. She greeted him politely, then took a seat in front of his imposing mahogany desk. "Thank you for seeing me, Senator Farnsworth," she began, her tone measured. "I represent Elena Perez, who was recently detained by ICE. She informs me that you discovered her status and decided to report her. That's within your rights, of course, but we believe there may be extenuating circumstances, especially concerning her attempts to regularize her status and your possible prior knowledge of her situation." Farnsworth stiffened. "I had no knowledge until shortly before I reported her. Hiring her was a mistake on the part of my staff. I corrected the situation." "Understood," Grace said, maintaining composure. "But there's more to her story. Elena's case might qualify for a stay of removal if she can prove certain factors, like her role as a contributing member of the community and the hardship her deportation would cause. If you'd be willing to testify that she was indeed a valuable worker, that you were satisfied with her performance, it could help her significantly." Farnsworth let out a mirthless chuckle. "You want me to testify on behalf of someone who was working here illegally? That's preposterous." "Perhaps," Grace admitted. "But if you help, we can avoid a legal conflict that could draw undesirable press coverage for you. If we go public with the details, especially about how quickly she was removed and whether she was threatened, you could find yourself in a more complicated position. You have to consider the optics of a federal court hearing, especially if the press gets interested in how your staff handles documentation checks." Farnsworth clenched his jaw. "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," the lawyer replied calmly. "It's a statement of facts. My client's well-being depends on whether she can prove that she's not a threat and that she has the backing of people willing to speak to her good character. You're in a unique position to offer that support if you so choose. It could mean the difference between her staying here legally or being deported. And from what I can tell, that difference might also protect you from further negative coverage." Farnsworth's eyes burned with irritation. He hated being cornered. "I'll think about it," he snapped. "I'm not making any promises." Grace nodded, politely gathering her folder. "I appreciate your time, Senator. Feel free to have your counsel contact me if you want to discuss it further." She left, and Farnsworth sat brooding in silence. The idea of testifying to help someone he had just reported seemed absurd. Yet the possibility of an escalating media scandal tugged at the edges of his mind. Even though he believed he had acted lawfully, the press could spin it in 1,000 ways. He pictured headlines screaming about a senator's double standard, railing against illegal immigration while secretly employing an undocumented worker. Worse, he couldn't shake the lingering memory of Elena's eyes, red from crying, as she was led out of his home. He tried to forget it all, diving into other matters, legislation on federal spending, calls with donors, the next steps in planning a major fundraiser for his campaign. Veronica was thoroughly invested in that event, scheduling daily phone calls with prospective sponsors, triple-checking the guest list. She noticed Farnsworth's distraction, but assumed it was just the usual campaign stress. A few nights after the meeting with Grace Randall, Farnsworth sat in his study at home, reading the local newspapers. A short blurb on an inside page mentioned that an undocumented housekeeper from a senator's residence had been detained. It did not mention Farnsworth by name, but the description was enough to cause him unease. If a bigger outlet picked it up, or if Grace Randall followed through on her hints, it could blow up. He could see his poll numbers taking a hit, especially with moderate voters who balked at cruelty. Then something unexpected happened. Farnsworth began to feel not just concern for his image, but an actual pang of remorse. For so long he had convinced himself that rules mattered above all else, that personal stories, like a housekeeper struggling to send money to family, were sentimental footnotes. Now, for reasons he couldn't fully grasp, that logic was unraveling. It might have been the cumulative stress, or maybe it was the fact that he had looked directly into Elena's face when he told her he would report her, had seen a genuine human fear. He poured himself a glass of whiskey to calm his nerves, telling himself that he was overthinking. Yet over the next few days, the feeling persisted. He found himself wondering what had become of Elena after she was taken away. Had she been moved to a detention facility? Was she awaiting a hearing that might end in deportation? Did she have anyone else to advocate for her besides that persistent lawyer? One afternoon, Farnsworth picked up his phone and dialed Grace Randall's number. She answered briskly, seeming surprised. "Yes, Senator. I want more information about Elena's case," he said, trying to keep his voice controlled. "What exactly would my involvement entail?" Grace explained that the immigration judge would hold a preliminary hearing soon to determine whether Elena qualified for a stay of removal. If Farnsworth were to submit a formal statement that attested to Elena's reliability, good character, and role in his household, it could bolster her argument. Possibly, he could appear in person to address any questions the judge might have. Farnsworth muttered that he would consider it, then quickly ended the call. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in him. On one level, he dreaded looking weak or inconsistent. On another level, he recognized that helping Elena might be the cleaner option compared to letting the press sensationalize her plight. That night, Farnsworth shared the barest details of the matter with Veronica. She rolled her eyes, exasperated. "What do you mean you're considering testifying for her?" she demanded. "Gregory, you do realize how that will look to your donors, not to mention the more conservative wing of the party. They'll say you're going soft on immigration just to hide your mistake." He clenched his fists. "Would you rather I face a messy lawsuit or negative press? The lawyer claims she'll go public if I don't cooperate. And besides," he paused, fighting a twinge of guilt, "I'm not sure if it's right just to wash our hands of it." Veronica stared at him in disbelief. "Since when do you worry about what's right?" she said, her tone cutting. "You've always known how to manage these things. If you waver now, you risk far more than a handful of bad headlines. Think of the donors, the committees you chair. Our entire standing in DC depends on not looking indecisive." That last word, indecisive, stung. Farnsworth prided himself on being decisive. And indeed, making a 180 turn on Elena's case felt like a betrayal of the iron principles he often touted in front of cameras. But part of him couldn't let the matter go. Without responding further to Veronica, he left the conversation hanging. In the days that followed, Farnsworth grappled with a sense of moral confusion he wasn't accustomed to. His usual method of dealing with problems, ruthless clarity, just didn't quiet his misgivings. He pressed forward with his Senate responsibilities, giving floor speeches, meeting with caucus leaders, drafting language for a defense spending package. But in the back of his mind, Elena's situation loomed, large and persistent. Finally, he decided. He told Grace Randall he would attend the hearing, at least to observe. He justified it to himself as a necessary damage control measure. If testifying in Elena's favor prevented a larger scandal, so be it. He also reasoned that it might be possible to shape his statement in a way that didn't undermine his political stance on immigration. The morning of the hearing was cold and drizzly. Farnsworth woke early, left Veronica behind at the house, and drove himself into the city, wanting as little fanfare as possible. He wore a dark suit and a simple overcoat, trying to blend in among the everyday traffic. Upon arriving at the modest immigration court building, he slipped through a side entrance. Grace Randall greeted him in a hallway near the courtroom, offering a polite nod. "Thank you for coming, Senator. Elena is in a holding area right now. The hearing will start soon." Farnsworth just nodded, glancing around nervously to see if any reporters were present. He spotted no familiar press faces, but the place was crowded with other immigrants and their relatives, all waiting for their turn before the judge. The hall smelled faintly of stale coffee. Farnsworth felt out of place, overshadowed by the raw human tension that seemed to emanate from the people around him. Some carried files of documents, some fidgeted with cell phones, others clutched their children's hands. When Eleanor was finally brought forward, Farnsworth was startled by how drawn and exhausted she looked compared to the quiet, efficient housekeeper he remembered. Her eyes darted toward him, then lowered, as if unsure whether to meet his gaze. He felt a constriction in his chest he couldn't explain, a pang of discomfort at seeing her in such a vulnerable position. Handcuffed, an immigration officer at her side. They entered a small hearing room with drab walls and fluorescent lighting. The immigration judge, a serious-looking woman in her 50s, presided from a raised platform. Elena's lawyer introduced Farnsworth, stating that, while he had reported Elena, he was also prepared to speak to her character and performance. That paradox clearly intrigued the judge, who fixed Farnsworth with a probing stare. He cleared his throat and explained in careful terms that Elena had worked for him for over a year, never caused trouble, never displayed any dishonesty. He acknowledged that she was diligent in her duties and that he was, in fact, surprised when he learned she had no valid documentation. Though his statement was somewhat clinical, Grace gently guided him to emphasize Eleanor's positive attributes. Elena stood to one side, hands clasped, tears in her eyes. Farnsworth avoided looking at her too directly. The guilt was almost palpable. Nonetheless, he stuck to the statement he'd prepared, making it clear that he didn't want to see her face undue hardship, which might be read as a subtle nod that he would be okay if the court exercised discretion in her favor. When the hearing ended, the judge announced that she would consider the evidence and schedule another session to deliver a ruling. Elena was led away, and Farnsworth, after a last glance, left the building with long strides, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. On the surface, he told himself he had done this for political reasons, to avoid scandal. Yet a deeper layer of him felt that he might have owed Elena that small gesture of decency. He returned home in silence. Veronica, who was hosting a phone call with a potential big donor, scowled when she saw his expression. Once she finished, she confronted him. "You look like you've been dragged through a storm," she said, crossing her arms. "What happened in court?" He gave a terse summary, and she shook her head in exasperation. "Gregory, this is exactly the sort of drama you pride yourself on avoiding. Once the press learns you testified in favor of an undocumented worker." He cut her off. "I did what needed to be done." She glared at him, frustration etched in her features, but she let the matter drop for the moment. Their relationship, once based on shared ambition, felt increasingly strained. The approaching fundraiser, originally planned as an extravagant event where the two of them would dazzle donors, now had an awkward undercurrent of tension. Farnsworth threw himself into the logistics anyway, trying to maintain the facade that everything was fine. The fundraiser took place in a grand hotel ballroom. Ornate chandeliers illuminated dozens of round tables where donors sipped champagne and conversed about policy and power. Veronica circulated with the practiced grace of a seasoned socialite, exchanging pleasantries. Farnsworth, typically adept at schmoozing high-net-worth individuals, went through the motions. Yet his mind drifted back to the drab immigration hearing room. He felt strangely off-balance, as if the foundation of his carefully crafted persona was cracking beneath him. At one point in the evening, Farnsworth excused himself and slipped into a quiet corridor just outside the ballroom, trying to gather his composure. Veronica, who had been watching him closely, followed. She looked at him with narrowed eyes. "We're in the middle of the most important fundraiser of the quarter, Gregory. Try to focus. Whatever guilt trip you're on, it's affecting your performance tonight." He exhaled slowly. "Veronica, have you ever stopped to think about what we do to people like her, when they fall outside our perfect system?" She stared at him in disbelief. as though he was speaking a foreign language. Why would I dwell on that? We're in politics. People make their own choices, and we enforce the law. You've always been clear about that. His shoulders slumped. He realized that the gap between them was widening in ways they might never bridge. He forced a smile and returned to the ballroom, greeting donors with a veneer of politeness. But inside he felt hollow. Days turned into weeks, and Farnsworth waited for word from Grace Randall about the judge's decision. In the meantime, he found out that Veronica had been speaking with some of his staff behind his back, telling them to keep an eye on any further developments in Elena's case. She was terrified that a single tweet or blog post could spiral into a full-blown scandal. One evening, Farnsworth came home after a lengthy Senate session. He was reviewing some notes for an upcoming vote when his phone buzzed. It was Grace, leaving a voicemail. "Senator, the judge has scheduled a follow-up hearing. I strongly advise you to appear again, if possible. Elena's chances depend on showing continuity of support." He played the message 3 times, sighing at the thought of more entanglement. When Veronica demanded to know who had called, Farnsworth simply said, "It's about Elena's hearing," and her frustration boiled over. They argued late into the night, exchanging accusations. She accused him of risking everything they'd built. He accused her of treating human lives like inconveniences. The argument ended with Veronica storming out, threatening to cancel or postpone their wedding indefinitely if he persisted in this destructive course. Farnsworth felt a strange mix of anger and liberation. The wedding, in truth, had started feeling more like a transaction than a heartfelt union. He crawled into bed alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps this rupture was inevitable. When the day of the second hearing arrived, Farnsworth went alone. No aides, no Veronica, no press. Grace greeted him in the courthouse lobby, wearing a look of guarded optimism. She mentioned that Elena had managed to gather additional letters of support from community members she had quietly helped, a neighbor whose child she sometimes babysat, a local woman she assisted with errands. Farnsworth was surprised. He had never imagined Elena having such ties beyond his household. In the hearing room, the judge reviewed the new statements. Farnsworth again offered a reserved but supportive testimony, stating that he had never had problems with Elena's work and believed she posed no threat to society. Elena, visibly nervous, stood by Grace's side, occasionally glancing at Farnsworth with a mix of gratitude and lingering hurt. Then came a moment that nearly undid Farnsworth's composure. The judge asked Elena why she had come to the US in the first place. Elena's voice trembled as she talked about her family's struggles in Mexico, an ailing father, a younger brother who managed to get a work visa but was barely making ends meet, a cycle of poverty that offered no escape. Farnsworth had read about these stories countless times in policy briefs, but hearing it from someone he knew, even tangentially, felt different. At the end of the session, the judge took a long pause, then announced that considering all the evidence, Elena Perez would be granted a temporary stay during which she could pursue legal avenues for remaining in the country. The judge stressed that any violation of the law during this period would revoke her privilege. Elena broke down in tears. Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Farnsworth, standing off to the side, exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for hours. As they left the courtroom, Eleanor approached Farnsworth in the hallway. "I never thought you would come," she murmured. "Thank you, Senator. It means a lot." He felt an unfamiliar lump in his throat. He had no grand speech prepared, so he simply nodded. After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you need any formal references for employment, contact my office. I'll provide something. I can't guarantee, but if it helps, I'll do what I can." Elena's eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and relief. She took the card with trembling hands. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice scarcely above a whisper. In the parking lot, Farnsworth paused, looking at the plain, nondescript building that housed so many lives in limbo. He wondered if this was the first time he had ever truly thought about the human faces behind the policies he so vocally championed. Returning home, he found that Veronica's belongings were partially gone. One of the staff quietly informed him that she had packed in a hurry and left earlier in the day. He discovered a curt note on his desk in her elegant handwriting. "I won't stand by and watch you sabotage your career for a housekeeper. Call me when you've remembered what matters." Farnsworth read the note twice, then placed it in a drawer. His phone buzzed with messages, some from Veronica, some from staffers wanting updates on various political matters. Instead of diving into the usual flurry of calls, he simply sat alone in his study. The silence felt both heavy and oddly calming. In the days that followed, Farnsworth's personal life and political stance began to shift. He took on a more moderate tone in immigration discussions, occasionally hinting in interviews that there might be circumstances under which people who came here illegally should be given a path to remain. This caused a stir in certain circles that had once cheered his hardline approach. Some of his old allies demanded explanations. Veronica, hearing about his shift through the grapevine, was incensed, calling him to threaten that if he kept bending on immigration, he would lose powerful donors. But Farnsworth found himself increasingly indifferent to those threats. He gave a major speech on the Senate floor about the complexities of immigration, acknowledging that while the law needed to be upheld, there were also humanitarian factors that could not be dismissed. "We must balance security with compassion," he declared, feeling an unaccustomed sense of conviction. Meanwhile, Grace Randall kept Farnsworth updated on Elena's progress. She had been released from detention and was looking for new work, though her options were limited until she could secure the proper permits. Farnsworth arranged for a formal letter of recommendation from his office, stating that Elena had worked under him and had never presented any security or behavioral problems. When his staff asked if he was certain about sending such a letter, he said yes, forging ahead despite their concern that it might seem contradictory to his older stances. The local press sniffed around the story, some praising Farnsworth's newfound humanity, others calling it opportunistic or hypocritical. A handful of progressive outlets championed him as a man who had seen the light after witnessing the real-life impact of deportation. Conservative commentators, on the other hand, lambasted him for betraying his base. He found himself in a difficult middle ground, but for once, he wasn't consumed by the polls or the talk shows. He even met privately with Elena's younger brother, Miguel, who had come by the senator's office to express gratitude. They spoke for nearly half an hour, an eternity by Farnsworth's usual standards. Miguel explained how Elena used to send money back home for their father's medicine, how her departure had thrown the family into crisis. Farnsworth listened, asking questions about the region they came from, the difficulties with official paperwork, the slow, bureaucratic processes that trapped so many immigrants in limbo. By the end of their meeting, Farnsworth felt a mingling of shame and cautious resolve. Meanwhile, Veronica tried twice more to reconcile. She dropped by Farnsworth's house unannounced, rattling on about how they could salvage the wedding if he returned to a stricter approach and made some statement about how one case didn't change his stance. Farnsworth stood in the foyer, arms crossed, letting her talk until it became clear she was only worried about how his pivot might reflect on her own ambitions. He politely said that perhaps they wanted different things, and she left in a huff. The wedding invitations that had already been printed were quietly discarded.